Di was telling us, just to start, this funny story yesterday. I'm going to use your story, Di, when we were at lunch about Kath Bappler, who's doing Feldenkrais with preppies and year 3 and 4. And she said, it's so funny because, well, how did you describe it, Di? Here was the wall.
So that was Kath against the wall there.
Yeah.
Trying to get them to, if you've ever seen Rex, they love being together. So she said, bring your chair, spread out your chair. So they sort of spread them out. But then they got a bit worried and they just moved closer and closer and closer. So there was 4 cats there, surrounded by not separate from each other. They wanted each chair to be as close as possible.
So what happens?
We're not clumped we're not clumped.
Yeah, clumping's a nice word, Margaret. It's a nice word. Okay, what I wanted to start today off with, because you've got your first group teaching today, is just, I suppose, being clear on our expectations of you, which are that you've had the opportunity to enter into a learning opportunity. This is a learning place for you where you can have an approximation of questions you have, things you want to try. The biggest thing I would say to you all is do not put an expectation on yourself that I should teach like anyone else. That I'm trying to be someone, or this is the way it should be, this is the way I should teach, and really leave open the possibilities for yourselves. You know, you'll hear me say this over and over again. What I'm looking for is that you develop your style of teaching ATM. And hopefully from the different teachers you've already had, you can see that everyone has their own style of teaching ATM, the things that they're more interested in, you know, the work as a whole. You can see where people's passions are, and yet they're all teaching awareness through movement. And that's what we really hope for you, that you bring yourselves to this, and that what you're trying to do through these processes of teaching, especially here where you're simply teaching to each other, it's a great opportunity for feedback, to be able to be vulnerable and to go, this is where I am, this is what I'd like feedback on. And to, as I said, find your voice as an ATM teacher, to really find what's important to you. One other thing, a couple of the groups yesterday said, oh, the ATM's way too long, that I don't think we'll get through it all. No? Absolutely fine if you don't get through it all. No? If your thing is that you're interested in the process more than the movements, which is what we'd like you to do, and to also realise that in many ATMs it's the variations themselves that are the learning, rather than you necessarily having to put a lot of awareness, a lot of attention on it. It's simply the variations themselves and being in really unusual positions and having to find yourself in unusual orientations that are a huge part of the learning. But hopefully, as we discuss more of the lessons from the ATM book and you teach more, those things are going to become more obvious. So biggest thing I'd say is just enjoy yourself when you're teaching this afternoon and tomorrow. Okay, next thing I wanted to go through is this whole idea of proximal distal that I know Susan probably went through with you. I'm pretty sure she would have in the pelvic clock series. I know she did.
Stephanie.
Oh, Stephanie. She would have gone through with you in the pelvic clock series?
I don't remember.
We're going to go through it again anyway. And that's the thing. How many iterations do we need before it's like, I get that. So at the moment, what's your understanding of proximal distal and why we might use it in ATMs or in FI. Just up.
The one that's close is proximal.
Proximal's more central,
More central.
distal is more
So you
further
do this with
away.
your hands, and that's proximal, and that's distal. And then it's like, is this proximal stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Out here?
So that's relating to, is it closer to the centre or further away? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Related to the gravity force of the center of the gravity force within our body as well. Is there any relationship there?
There probably is. It's not how I think about it, but could very well be.
The proximity is related to the center
Yeah.
of our system.
Yes.
And the muscles that are proximal usually are bigger.
Yes, absolutely.
It's more sort of power.
Absolutely.
That center.
Mm.
That can be health or movement that needs to be distal.
Mm. It's a pretty good description. Mm. Anything else? Yeah, Nicole. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What is that? Initiate movement more distal place than
Many people. Mm. 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 And it's interesting, you know, if you do look at our sensory motor cortex, it's the periphery that often has a big input, much more input than, say, the torso does. Okay, so let's do a little description. So it's a lot to do with muscle and how muscle works. Actually, I can use this. So if we've got a big weight here, a heavy weight, which we could say is the torso, because actually I'll go back a step and we talk about muscle a little bit more. So most muscles, if you read in anatomical literature, there's an origin and there's an insertion. So most of you would have heard of that a muscle has an origin and an insertion. The origin is nearly always more proximal. So if you read about a muscle, the origin of a muscle will always be more proximal to the insertion. So for example, really easy one, biceps that most of you know, the origin comes from here and in here and comes down to insert just below the elbow. Or the hamstrings, I'm giving you the hopefully names that you've heard of. The hamstrings comes from the sit bone, divides into 3 parts and comes and inserts around the knee. So generally, the origin is always, I'm trying to think, is there an exception to that? Can't think of one. The diaphragm's a bit of an exception in the pelvic floor, but they're a little different. So that's generally what it is. Origin more central or proximal, insertion more distal. Generally, most muscles have a much bigger area of origin than insertion.
Do they also have a different structure?
Muscles absolutely have different ways that they line up in their...
From the insertion to the origin to the insertion. Is it structured differently or is it just anchored differently in the side?
It's usually anchored, that's what I'm saying. So generally for the origin, it comes more directly off a big piece of bone. Yeah? The difference would be the facial muscles that really attach to fascia, which is why they're so mobile, rather than the expressive muscles. So again, if we had big glute maximus, your bum muscle, it's going to take a huge origin from here. Really big area of bone that it's coming from, and it's going to go down and insert into this little bone here. So the origin is nearly always bigger. The insertion is usually tendon-based. So the muscle tissue comes down into a tendon, and then that will insert into bone. Yeah? So because it's smaller, it only needs a small area of insertion. So always, as I said, I'm not going to say categorically, but generally, origin, bigger area, insertion, much smaller area. Yeah? And it makes sense, doesn't it, if you're going to be pulling something bigger, the bigger area you've got to pull from, the better. Okay, so that's origin insertion. So if we've got a big weight here, that's going to take a fair amount of work to pull. So if we say this is our big glute muscle that's attached to our pelvis, and this is attached to the leg bone. So muscles are made up of contractile tissue. What they do is contract or let go of their contraction. Yeah? So if this muscle has to contract, and a muscle's always going to contract from both ends, which of these is going to move more?
Distal.
The distal. No? So if this is going to pull, this is always going to move more than this end. And that's why a little bit, as you were saying, our arms and legs move a lot more through space than our torso does. You know, because it's much lighter to move a limb toward the centre than to move the centre toward a limb. So many of our habitual configurations are always that the limbs are moving, shortening especially, toward the centre. So they'll be shortening in some way toward the centre when muscles work this way. So if you're all sitting and you put your hands behind you, and just start to slide one leg towards you and away from you along the floor. And there'll be lots of different muscles working here, depending on how you're doing the movement. But you can feel it's very easy for your leg to go through quite a large range of movement. Yeah? So that's your distal part, moving easily. What's your proximal part doing, which is your pelvis? Does it move? Yeah? But it's a much smaller movement. Can you feel that? So your pelvis is moving, but it does a much smaller movement. And because you're all such good Feldenkrais people now, your pelvises move. What happens with the majority of my clients where you don't let your pelvis move? What's the work involved then? If you don't let both ends of the muscles move, can you feel what immediately happens in your effort? Effort.
And I'm actually using all of me, all the way down my trunk to try and get my left leg as my right leg.
So there's this, what we're finding is there's this difference between something not moving or something being more still, but it's got that availability of movement there. Some people might do the opposite. They might, so what happens if your pelvis initiates the movement this time? So you do a big movement with your pelvis. And again, you'll feel it's effortful again. If you're doing a great big movement of your pelvis, but your leg's not really coming along for the ride. No? So what happens is when muscles work really efficiently, usually the torso just does a little bit of movement and the limbs move more through space. Okay, so habitual. Now could you put your soles of your feet together? So now we've fixed the legs. So we've now fixed the distal part. So I've held this. now in place. Doesn't mean it hasn't got a bit of give, but we've held it in place. So now if you're going to tilt your pelvis towards your feet, which is what you were doing yesterday, that's why this for many people is really unfamiliar, because we're now moving the proximal part toward the distal. You know? And it's doing a much larger range of movement than the distal part. You know?
And it's doing it from a bigger base, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's got a really different feel. Can you feel there's a very different feel to your experience of the movement when you're moving the proximal toward the distal? It's, as you said, a bit more of you has to...
So it feels like it feels bigger than it probably actually physically is. More of you from the core has to be involved.
Because you're not moving this very much. Huh? But again, feel the difference if as you do it, if you just let the legs go really floppy, so they're not doing anything. Now try and do it. And again, that won't be, again, that easy, because now you've sort of disengaged the distal end. Does that make sense to people? You can feel that? No?
Because it's non-habitual, it just feels really all disconnected for me.
Now, put your feet together again. Just find, so you've got a little bit of work going on there, but your feet are still mobile. Now take your proximal forward and feel now, that's when the knees begin to respond. Because now you've got both ends of the muscles, because it's quite a few muscles working here, working. But you can feel that the feet and the knees are doing much less movement than the pelvis. Huh? So again, this is very non-habitual for people to do, and this is why it makes such a big change. Makes a huge change in people's organisations, because we're so used to bringing things to us, not us going, so, you know, how often would we do that to have a cup of tea?
Only when you're really sick.
And that's important that you can do it, but generally we would be bringing things to us, bringing things to here rather than going. But it's a great movement to do for people, to get really non-habitual. So just feel now, if some of you have got it, Ruth's got a cup. If you had a cup in your hand, bring your cup to your mouth and feel what happens if you don't let anything happen in your chest and your shoulder girdle. This is the same principle. If you fixate this, the muscle can't work efficiently. No? And then just let your shoulder girdle do anything. I don't care what you let it do, but let it move. And feel the difference in the lightness of your arm, yeah, in the ease of what it happens. Then keep it fixed and move your head to your arm. And you'll feel that even as you do that, the hand will move a little bit. Yeah? If you kept that really fixated in space and did it again, can you feel how much more work it is? Huh? Feldenkrais used to do these great talks about, he said, one of the reasons, you know, when apes are on trees, that they would never grip with the thumb because that's fixating it. So it can't move as easily. This becomes fixed, so you can't swing. They would always do that, which allows this to swing through space. Now, it's exactly the same principle that we're talking about. If you fix something too much, but if you've got a little bit of a give in there, the muscle can still work.
And we adapted this thumb, which is opposing, so obviously we have multi-use of that. We've got that, and then we've got that. They're two completely different uses.
This is really for fine manipulative tasks that we'll talk about another day. So does that help you a little bit to get the idea of why we do these movements of fixing the periphery, if you like, which is what you're doing here, fixing the periphery, fixing the hands, but never does fixing mean that they can't move. No? And that's the hardest thing. So, you know, because if I lean back, so if I'm here, I'll do a little bit what you were doing, Marissa. So when Marissa goes back to put her arms, all of her weight goes back onto her arms. So really, at this point, she's got nothing on her feet. No? So this is another idea of proximal distal where we're looking for counterbalance. When are we looking for counterbalance as a way of exploring movement, and when are we using movement through space? So do people understand what I mean by counterbalance? Okay, have a stand up. Let's do a really simple, and then we'll come back to that to see. Simple counterbalance. So, you know, if I'm doing an EMG study and I've got all the little electrodes on all my muscles to see what happens, and I swing my arm forward without any intention of going anywhere. So, you know, the experimenter said, lift your arm. Yeah? What should happen in ideal function is as soon as I start to lift my arm forward, my pelvis will go back. That's counterbalance. So I'm not going anywhere in space. I'm staying sort of where I am, and I'm just going, oh, I want to take my arm up.
I suppose it becomes more obvious if you do it in a way, and you really become aware that you have to. Yes.
And counterbalance is a really valuable thing for people to have. The difference is if I want to go somewhere. No? Because if I want to reach out there to get something, to move through space, my pelvis is going to go in the same direction. So our brains are constantly getting all this information fed into our system about whether my intention is to go somewhere or
get that and bring it to you.
Yeah. And these are strategies we're using all the time in awareness through movement lessons. Yeah? So Marissa, if you can just sit down for a minute again, because it's just, you don't mind. No? So again, Marissa's forward, come forward, take your hands forward. Yeah? And Marissa, you can see, is really pretty well organised to do that. She's pretty comfortable to have a weight distributed between a pelvis and a feet. So if we said, put your arms behind you, Marissa, can you feel what you normally do? Yeah? So have you got any weight on your feet now? Not much. Yeah, probably a little bit more. So come back and do what you did yesterday. Yeah? Yeah, remember we said at the beginning, we were saying, oh, you can really see how much weight's going down into her arms, because she moved in a direction rather than a counterbalance. So if she's moved in a direction, it's going to not be easy for her to bring her pelvis forward. Come forward again. This time take your arms back, but think about, I'm just redistributing my weight. So I've still got my feet, I've still got my pelvis, and I'm going to include my arms in the image. Yeah? Can you feel the difference in your organisation? And now take your pelvis forward. It's already forward. Yeah, but can you feel how much, you can see how easy it is for her to move from her pelvis.
Her pelvis didn't actually shift before she rolled.
It did shift. It counterbalanced her. Huh? Because she was taking her arms back. So something really, if I'm going to take my arms back and feel supported, what should my pelvis? In some way, you would think it's going to shift the weight forward a little bit to counterbalance the weight going back. But the majority of people will do what you did, Marissa. They take this back and their pelvis does a big roll back as well.
So would that be considered counterbalance as well as feet counterbalancing?
Yeah, she's now more in a counterbalanced position, so her weight is more distributed over all her areas of support. So it's the difference, stay there Marissa, it's the difference in standing. If you take your weight forward right to the edge of your feet, so right to your toes, what are you trying to do to counterbalance there? To stop you moving backwards. Yeah, you'll all have different strategies, but, you know, would you be taking your pelvis forward at this point? This is what we were talking about yesterday. How is the pelvis going to decelerate or stop us from going forward? But they're probably also, because you're right at the edge of, you won't have quite as much adaptability in your torso as you would if you had your whole foot on the ground and could move your weight around a much bigger base of support. So because Marissa's now got a bigger base of support, she's got her feet, she's got her hands, and she's got a pelvis. She's going to have, purely because of the organisation she's in, she can now give up a lot of the habitual work she does in her torso to hold herself up. Because this weight is all distributed. So I know with Marissa, this is all going to be much more available for movement. Because her system is not going, I have to support myself, let all your weight rock back again. Now it's mainly here. I know that this
I already feel tense of it.
is not going to be available. She can't give it up because her weight's all back here. So it has those muscles. Remember, Feldenkrais, you can only do one thing at a time. Muscle can only do one thing. So if Marissa needs it to hold herself up, she can't let it go to change its shape, to explore all these different movements. So this is another, if you like, proximal distal. Where distal, we're giving lots of support out distally to allow the proximal to become more available for movement. Hands and knees would be exactly the same, as long as you get the organisation and the weight shift. Great.
I think it was a really habitual thing for me to do that. So because I felt like I didn't have much awareness here, I felt like I could do a bigger movement through space, maybe from here. So it's really interesting, but I can still get the same.
And as you get more organised, you'll be able to take your arms further back with taking all your weight onto them. Yeah, as you get more length and availability through your torso. Yeah. Okay, so just have a lie down and see if you can feel that on sitting and feel that on yourselves. Just what's the difference in this counterbalance? So you start at the front and then you just start to lean your arms back and feel, what do you do? Huh? So as soon as you go back, is your pelvis rolling back? Because if it is, you're going to have a lot of weight on your arms. Or is there a difference if I take my arms back and maybe my pelvis does a little counterbalance? So what we're going to really, or what I'm going to hammer home a lot here, is this availability of the pelvis to generate the movement, to generate the power. And for all of you to become more aware of, where is my pelvis? Is it available for movement, or am I trying to move it from somewhere else rather than my pelvis? And just to maybe understand some of the structures of the lessons a little bit more in some of these principles that are deeply, deeply embedded in them, about how we organise ourselves in space. Can people feel the difference? No? And again, just really feel the difference in how much availability you're going to have through your torso, through your shoulders. If you've put most of the weight into one place in your base of support, rather than allowing it to distribute around your whole base of support. So everything, I suppose what we're getting to is everything always has to be in your image. No? It's that big thing of what's happening throughout all of me. Great. Okay. As long as it's distributed, which should be the easiest thing to lift? In this position. The pelvis. If you've really distributed the weight, because it's the centre. So once you get that weight distributed, this should be the lightest thing to move around your base of support. Yeah? And again, this is what a child's learning in all its coming onto its hands and knees. And how do I find this ability for my pelvis to... So again, if you had to lift one of the edges of your base of support, which is your hand, how would you do it really lightly? What would you have to do that? You have to do something with the pelvis. Where would your pelvis have to go to unweight your hand? Yeah. You actually have to do a very big movement. This is the ATM out of the elusive obvious. Yeah? You actually have to, because it's the periphery of your base of support, you're going to actually have to move quite a bit in space to begin to lift it away from the ground. Legs are a little bit different because you've got them closer. This would be different. So if I had my feet here, how much am I going to have to move through space to get one of those feet off the ground? Again, I have to do a bigger movement than if they're more midline. So there's always this method in his madness. Why does he put the soles of the feet together? How does he work? What's he offering you the opportunity to learn by these different positions? And you've got to keep remembering he was an engineer and a physicist.
And a wicked man with a sense of humour.
Absolutely. But he understood mass. He understood centre of gravity and base of support. He understood what you had to have to stand in the gravitational field, what you had to understand. Often they'll tend to go toward that. And again, you can see, just as Marisha said, the babies, I can't do what they do, but they're really floppy. So their legs aren't connected. And that disables them as well. Because you've got to, just as we were saying here, you've got to have that connection of the proximal to the distal and the distal to the proximal. But generally, as we get more organised and the proximal comes more into its own, which is what most of the lessons you're doing at the moment are about, I would say the whole of the first year of Amherst is about you finding more and more of your proximal. You find your limbs get lighter and longer because they're not doing the work of pulling you in. It was interesting, I did a workshop for community physios in Perth. Wonderful group of people, just wonderful. And I said, well, what would you like me to present it on from a Feldenkrais perspective, Because I think I've learnt over time it's much easier to have a particular thing to present on than to go in and give a big picture. And they said, oh, all the kids we see with short hamstrings. Short hamstrings. We just, don't get that far. They were so open to the idea that none of these kids can move through their centre. That's why they have short hamstrings. No mobility at all through here. So they're constantly using their legs to heave them. Yeah, so if you're sitting at the moment, if you sit on your knees at the moment and just let your pelvis be really heavy. Let your torso just go, I don't do much work. And if you go to sit up, what's going to do the work? What are your hammies going to have to do to try and get you up? As soon as this becomes alive, this becomes in your image, your head gets connected, how then do you bring yourself up to kneeling? Yeah. So it's again us, us deeply understanding. So you know it in yourselves. Can you feel how easily you can go from one of those to the other? From your sensory motor experience of when I don't let anything happen in my torso, when I just let it, my pelvis isn't there, compared to the lift you get as soon as you allow all of yourself to be in the movement. And we'll just say this first, that's the beauty of Feldenkrais, that Feldenkrais understood. You don't really understand it. There's not a lot of sense in me talking to you about this unless you can feel it in your experience. Then it begins to make sense. Okay, sorry.
We were working here, why does it manifest in our legs? Why don't we feel along that?
I'll leave that question for you to just... No, because that's what it is. What's allowed. So maybe you don't feel longer, but something feels different in your middle. And the thing is to start investigating, well, what is different in here that's let me get longer in my arms and legs?
And you were saying before that our sensory cortex is not as high a representation of our torso in there. Maybe our ability to feel it is higher. Would you say we feel our extremities more?
Generally, if you see the maps, you'll see there's huge areas for the hands, lips, tongue, face, eyes, there's huge areas. Generally, the torso's not that big. It's this sort of pretty shriveled little thing. But again, I'm going to wonder, is it the person that you've done the original mapping on? Because I would assume now that I would have a much more varied map in my sensory motor cortex of my middle than I ever would have before I started Feldenkrais training.
There's a study. Is there? As I'm saying,
They should do a study. It'd be fantastic, wouldn't it? It'd be a great study to do. No, but it would. I think it'd be an absolutely wonderful study to do. What happens as you fill out your cortex. Mm, mm. Well, I think, what would be interesting, and we don't do it, I think what I'd like to do is when people start in a Feldenkrais training, take a video of yourself and have a look at it 4 years later.
But, and then we did the right sides and the left sides to get a sense of the two differences. But it's interesting watching the negative space.
Absolutely. And that's more a sort of picture, but I think it would be interesting just doing a roll to sit to stand. Do you know what I mean? Or something where you're really moving through space just to see what the difference is. Okay, time for an ATM, Lisa.